Let's look at passage 3 for the first time. It's easy to forget that most of the world's languages are still transmitted orally with no widely established written form. While speech communities are increasingly involved in projects to protect their languages, in print, on air, and online, orality is fragile and contributes to linguistic vulnerability. Okay. But indigenous language are about much more than unusual words and intriguing grammar. They function as vehicles for transmission of cultural traditions, environmental understandings, and knowledge about medicinal plants, all at risk when elders die and livelihoods are disrupted. Okay. In the first paragraph, they're talking of uh, most of the world's languages are orally transmitted from one person to another. There is no written record. There is no mechanism by which, if these people were to disappear off the face of this earth, that tradition will continue in future. And the language and the value of language is not limited to the words that it contains or the way sentences are structured within it. The value of the language is in terms of the cultural traditions being passed on, the knowledge which can only be understood in that language, or knowledge about medicinal plants, knowledge about all sorts of wonderful things. Once a language goes away, all that knowledge is also lost forever. Okay. Both push and pull factors lead to decline of languages. Through war, famine, and natural disasters, whole communities can be destroyed, taking their language with them to the grave, such as the indigenous populations of Tasmania, who were wiped out by colonists. More importantly, speakers live on but abandon their language in favor of another vernacular, a widespread process that linguists refer to as language shift, from which few languages are immune. Such trading up and out of a speech form occurs for complex political, cultural, and economic reasons, sometimes voluntary for economic and educational reasons, although often amplified by state coercion or neglect. Welsh, long stigmatized and disparaged by the British state, has rebounded with vigor. Okay. This paragraph is an example of why parajumbles don't make sense. Because usually, if you're going to talk up an idea, the last line of the paragraph should be a summary or something that should be a concluding statement. Here, without reference to anything else, the last line here about Welsh seems very out of place. But anyway, the both push and pull factors lead to decline of languages. First is mass deaths. Lots of people die because of war or famine or natural disasters. So if a bunch of people die, the language dies with them. More commonly, what happens is when people realize that some other language has advantages in the form of getting you better employment opportunities or getting you more social recognition and acceptance, then people shift there. This process is known as language shift, and language shift is usually aided by government support. And it is not ye language acha hai. It is like ye language ka utility nahi hai, and then by default people have to switch over. Then at the end there is an contradiction or an exception mentioned to the case. Welsh, which was not supported by the British state, has rebounded with vigor. Okay. Now the expectation is in the next paragraph, they'll be talking about Welsh or other examples that have rebounded. Let's go to next paragraph. Many speakers of endangered, poorly documented languages have embraced new digital media with excitement. Speakers of previously exclusively oral tongues are turning to the web as a virtual space for languages to live on. Okay. So one of the challenges that was mentioned earlier is if there is just a small group of people and the language was orally transmitted. Now, if we take it to the web, even if these people die, this language will continue to live on. One challenge has been solved or has been attempted to be solved. Internet technology offers powerful ways for oral traditions and cultural practices to survive, even thrive, among increasingly mobile communities. The mobile here refers to communities on the move, not necessarily communities using a cell phone. I have watched as videos of traditional wedding ceremonies and songs are recorded on smartphones in London by Nepali immigrants, then uploaded to YouTube and watched an hour later by relatives in remote Himalayan villages. Globalization is regularly and often uncritically. When it says uncritically, it means without reason or without giving all the sides of the argument an adequate look, not bina burai kiye. Critical means using all reasoning faculties. It does not translate into uncritically, matlab bura nahi bola usko. Globalization is regularly and often uncritically, without application of reason, pilloried or denounced as a major threat to linguistic diversity. But in fact, globalization is as much process as it is ideology. Certainly, when it comes to language, the real forces behind cultural homogenization are unbending beliefs exchanged through a globalized delivery system, reinforced by the historical monolinguism prevalent in much of the West. Okay. Hopefully you now understand my argument about Welsh के बारे में बात करी, उसके बाद पता नहीं कहाँ चलेगा. Basically, they started talking of internet or new digital media is helping languages that were previously being transmitted orally. Internet technology offers unprecedented access or storage compared to earlier times. Then an example was given, some wedding happening in London, recorded by a Nepali immigrant. 1 hour later, relatives in remote Himalayan village are able to watch that video. So language transmission or storage, that is happening wonderfully well. Then the idea turns to globalization is often demonized as the reason why languages are dying, but it is, in the opinion of the author, it is not appropriate to demonize globalization. Globalization is simply a vehicle. The bigger problem is the pervasive belief in the Western world that monolinguism or single language knowledge, single language focus is ideal. That is the problem. The globalization or the globalization delivery systems that we have, they're simply reflecting beliefs of the Western world rather than globalization causing monolinguism. That is the argument being given by the author. Monolinguism, the condition of being able to speak only one language, is regularly accompanied by deep-seated conviction in the value of that language over all others. Across the largest economies that make up the G8, being monolingual is still often the norm. So G8, the biggest economies in the world, they're being monolingual, they're being conducting their business in a single language is still usual, with multilingualism appearing unusual and even somewhat exotic. Oh, आप ये भी language बोल लेते हैं. Oh, आप ये भी language बोल लेते हैं. Those sort of things. Okay. So monolingual mindset stands in sharp contrast to the lived reality of most of the world. This monolinguistic mindset कि एक ही language होना चाहिए और एक ही language हम बोलेंगे, मेरे को एक ही language आता है, यही best है. This is not true for majority of the world. For a lot of people, that is not how things work out. Or for majority population on the planet, that is not how they operate. They are multilingual. So the monolingual mindset stands in sharp contrast to the lived reality of most of the world, which throughout its history has been more multilingual than unilingual. Multilingual than unilingual. एक ही language नहीं, multiple languages. Monolinguism then is not globalization. Monolinguism then, not globalization, should be our primary concern. Okay. Hopefully you understand the difference between unilingual and monolinguism. Unilingual is आपको एक लैंग्वेज आता है, monolinguism is एक ही लैंग्वेज जानना अच्छी चीज है, एक ही लैंग्वेज की जानकारी रखना is the better system. Okay. Multilingualism can help us live in a more connected and more interdependent world. By widening the access to technology, globalization can support indigenous and scholarly communities engaged in documenting and protecting our shared linguistic heritage. For the last 5,000 years, the rise and fall of languages was intimately tied to the plow, sword, and book. Hopefully, we know plow is a tool used for farming. So this is in reference to economy. This is in reference to war. And this is in reference to education. Okay. For the last 5,000 years, the rise and fall of languages was intimately tied to economy, the war, and education. In our digital age, the keyboard, screen, and web will play a decisive role in shaping the future linguistic diversity of our species. Okay. Basically, इंटरनेट के आने की वजह से या ऑनलाइन चीजें होने की वजह से languages will it will be more difficult to wipe out languages. Of course, that is not the intent, wiping out languages, but that is the general idea that is mentioned here. Let's see, question 9. The author lists all of the following as reasons for decline or disappearance of a language, except government promoting certain languages over the others. This was mentioned in the passage. Often amplified by state coercion or neglect. A catastrophic event that entirely eliminates people and their culture. This was mentioned through war, famine, and natural disasters. Whole communities can be destroyed. People shifting away from their own language to study or work in another language. This was also mentioned. Abandon their language in favor of another vernacular, a widespread process that linguists refers to language shift from which few languages are immune. Such trading up and out of a speech form occurs for complex political, cultural, and economic reasons, sometimes voluntary for economic and educational reasons. Language to study or work, economic and educational reasons. All three of them have been mentioned. The focus of a few languages as a result of widespread internet use. The passage is specifically opposing this idea. Option D, passage is specifically opposing this idea. In fact, they're saying widespread internet use is or globalization is unfairly maligned, but globalization is a delivery mechanism. In fact, internet, last line agar padhenge, the keyboard, the screen, and the web will play a decisive role in shaping the future linguistic diversity in our species. So, of course, it cannot be given the credit or discredit for decline or disappearance of language. So, fairly straightforward. Option D will be the answer. Question 10. From the passage that we can infer that the author is in favor of cultural homogenization. No, he is not in favor of cultural homogenization. He wants to protect languages. Language shifts across languages. See, if it was learning multiple languages, it would have been okay. Language shifts across languages would mean people are moving away from their native language to some other language because of economic and educational reason. Now, if it was only learning a new language, it would be okay. But the way language shifts have been defined in the passages, more commonly, speakers live on but abandon their language. Abandoning language is not something author would be in favor of, but between A and B, B is still better. Language shifts, at least people are learning two languages right now. C, an expanded state role in preservation of languages. Between B and C, I would say C is better. C is better because the government intervention, the government or state intervention in decline of languages has been mentioned. Now, often amplified by state coercion and neglect. So, of course, you can infer from there if the state plays a greater role, it would be better. But the problem is it says an expanded state role in preservation of languages. The problem is so far there has not been any, or at least the passage doesn't mention any state role in preservation of languages. It mentions a state role in decline of languages, not a state role in preservation of languages. So C has its own challenge. D, greater multilingualism. Between C and D, D is far, far better because multilingualism is something that the author is clearly in favor of. That is the entire thrust of the last two paragraphs. Okay. Question 11. We can infer all of the following about indigenous languages from the passage, except that option A, they are repository of traditional knowledge about the environment and the culture. सही बात है, ये लिखा था. They function as vehicles for transmission of cultural traditions, environmental understanding, and knowledge about medicinal plants. So they are repositories of traditional knowledge is something that is mentioned about indigenous languages. People are increasingly working on documenting these languages. This is also mentioned. Many speakers of endangered, poorly documented languages have embraced new digital media with excitement. Okay. There was something else. Okay, this is good enough proof. Option C, they are in danger of being wiped out as most can be transmitted orally. This was also mentioned. Orality is fragile and contributes to linguistic vulnerability. This was also mentioned. Option D, their vocabulary and grammatical constructs have been challenging to document. Now, their vocabulary and grammatical constructs have been called unusual, have been called intriguing, but this does not translate into they have been challenging to document. If at all they were challenging to document, speakers of previously exclusively oral tongues are turning to web as virtual space for languages to live on. If they were challenging to document, not speakers of origin, as in so many people would not have hopped onto the bandwagon and started documenting it, which means this is not something you can infer. This goes away, this goes away, this goes away. We are left with option D. Has to be the answer. Question 12. The author mentions the Welsh language to show that. Now, hopefully you also understand वेल्श लैंग्वेज का मेंशन सिर्फ इस क्वेश्चन के लिए हुआ है, अदरवाइज वेल्श लैंग्वेज का स्टेटमेंट वहां पे समझ में नहीं आता, और एटलीस्ट मेरे को समझ में नहीं आता. मे बी लिंग्विस्ट्स वुड हैव बेटर अंडरस्टैंडिंग. Efforts to integrate Welsh speakers in the English speaking fold have been fruitless. अच्छा, Welsh language का एग्जांपल क्यों आया था? Welsh, long stigmatized and disparaged by the British state, has rebounded with vigor. गवर्नमेंट इंटरवेंशन, गवर्नमेंट डिस्करेजमेंट के बावजूद Welsh has rebounded. Okay. Efforts to integrate Welsh speakers in the English speaking fold have been fruitless. Have they been fruitless? Not really. As in, they haven't succeeded entirely, but have they been fruitless? Not really. But let's go. Languages can revive even after the speakers have gone through a language shift. Between A and B, of course, B is better. Of course, B is better because this is long stigmatized and disparaged by British state, which is what was in reference to what a language shift is. People move from one language to the other for economic or educational reasons. Option C, vulnerable languages can rebound with state effort. State did not have a role to play in rebounding of Welsh. In fact, the state had a negative role to play in the dissemination of Welsh. So C goes away. D, while often pilloried, globalization can in fact support linguistic revival. While this is true with regards to whatever is mentioned in the passage, this is true. This was not in reference to the Welsh language. The Welsh language was given as an example of even against the odds when the state was actively dissuading people from pursuing Welsh or continuing conversation in Welsh. Welsh has still rebounded. So D goes away, B remains, and that is end of passage 3.